Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is Brenda Bailey-Hughes, who's an award-winning faculty member at the Kelley School of Business, where she teaches business communication and leadership courses. In this episode, we're going to explore why emotional intelligence is critical for your personal and professional growth. Because research has consistently shown that individuals with high EQ perform better in a wide range of roles and industries. They are more likely to be successful in their careers, have stronger relationships, and lead more fulfilling lives. Brenda's EQ model comprises of 4 parts, and we are going to be discussing the first 2 parts during today's episode: self-awareness and empathy. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program once again, Brenda.
Thank you, Charles. So nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jumping into this emotional intelligence episode, last episode, we really focused on one element, and you break down emotional intelligence into 4 elements. And the element that we really focus on, which is your favorite element, and perhaps now more important than ever, is empathy. So perhaps as we get started, let's just first, once again, define emotional intelligence, and then we'll speak a little bit about empathy before we get into those other 3 elements that we didn't have time for during our last episode.
Sure. So, emotional intelligence is a psychological construct that assesses our other intelligence, our other kind of smart. So, we have that academic or intellectual IQ. EQ, emotional quotient, is evaluating our ability to be self aware, to manage ourself, our emotions, and our lives, to have empathy, and then to use all of that within our relationship management piece. So those are the 4 competencies associated with this psychological construct called emotional intelligence. It really became popularized in the 90s when Daniel Goleman and his associates started studying managers and realized that a lot of managers and leaders' success was tied to this construct of emotional intelligence. They started seeing managers who got the bonuses based on very financial types of metrics. But what they were doing right was having and displaying and communicating emotional intelligence. And so that's when emotional intelligence in the business world started to blow up, and we all started taking a much harder look at it.
Perhaps just kind of go into a little more detail about, why emotional intelligence matters so much today and why perhaps it's more important than ever.
I'm not sure that it hasn't always been important. I'm just not sure we pretended like it wasn't. Maybe. Also, I mean, there are changes in our work culture for sure. I think that when we were in that industrial revolution and we were in that industrial stage, we didn't really have to give a lot of thought to the humanity in our workspaces. And then as we became more of an information age and our workers became less about just cranking out the widgets on a schedule and more about really tapping into their best thinking, their highest order thinking, when we became more and more collaborative, when teams started driving the success or hindering the success if our teams weren't high performance teams, we started to think, oh my goodness, we're going to have to pay attention to these more human elements, the not just the performance and the production, but the people part of the management scale. And then certainly now in the post-epidemic, in this culture where we're working remote and we have teams that are distributed more and more globally, that fact that we do have more global teams instantly brings more beautiful diversity and conflicting diversity into our conversations. And so emotional intelligence is what gives us the ability to manage that diversity in a better, more thoughtful way.
Now, last episode, we talked about maybe not the most important element, but the most popular element of emotional intelligence, and that was empathy. So I'd like to just give our listeners just a recap of this element, if you would, and just maybe some tips or techniques that they could use to improve their empathy.
Sure. Well, and you shared with our listeners that I call this one my favorite, and it is, but I do feel a little guilty saying that. It's kind of like I have one of four favorite children. You're never allowed to say that or think that. And all four of these competencies work so much together. They're so integrated that to pull them apart is more for the sake of trying to break it down, understand it, and then take action on it. In reality, they're very integrated. So empathy, you will see connections to all of them. But empathy is one of my favorites. It's one of my research interests. And in fact, it's kind of funny when I was on a plane not too long ago and someone said, "Well, what do you do?" And I say, "Well, I teach at a business school." And my seat partner said, "Oh, well, what do you teach?" And I said, "Well, I teach leadership, communication, and I research empathy." And he paused for me. He goes, "Wait, you teach empathy in a business school?" Like there was this, he thought these were two opposite things, that business people aren't empathetic. It just didn't even register for him. I said, "Oh no, actually, the best leaders are the empathetic leaders, especially the leaders that have figured out this both and of being empathetic and holding people accountable and not seeing those as two polar opposites, but as two integrated types of concepts." So, empathy is our ability to understand the world through someone else's eyes. That's cognitive empathy. I can see the world the way Charles sees it. I can understand the situation that you and I are experiencing the way you might see it. I can understand, maybe not agree, but I can understand with your position because I'm truly empathizing. I'm truly trying to understand your stance on something. That's cognitive empathy. That's sort of this mental approach to thinking about the world through the lens of someone else. And then there's also affective empathy, which is I can feel what Charles is feeling. When Charles is sad, I know how to feel sad with him. When he is aggravated, I can feel aggravation or anger with him. It's allowing myself to be vulnerable enough to experience the emotion of my conversational partner. Interestingly, affective empathy does have some downsides. As you can imagine, it leads to higher levels of burnout because if you think of healthcare workers feeling empathetic when everyone around them is sick or families of people that are in crises, it's a heavy emotional load. So we do need to build some boundaries on our affective empathy, but there's rarely a situation where a cognitively empathetic response is not a great thing to have. That's the definition of empathy.
How does that differ from sympathy? Because I hear that a lot that I'm sympathetic to their plight, but I'm not empathetic.
Yeah. Sympathetic might be I feel sorry for you. I feel bad for you. I'm not actually feeling it inside. I don't go through the mental process of understanding why you are feeling the way you're feeling or even how you're feeling. I just know you're in a bad space and all too bad for you. And I don't mean to belittle sympathy. A sympathetic response is not necessarily a bad response. I think sympathy sometimes drives generosity. When you feel the plight of others, you might want to engage in some type of generous caretaking of some sort. Empathy, though, I don't just feel sorry for you. I get you.
And that's a great distinction between the two because a lot of people get those confused, and the great leaders have empathy. They go one step beyond being sympathetic for that person. The other thing that you mentioned regarding empathy before we move on to the next element is really how do you balance empathy with accountability? Because in most cases, I've seen this happen personally, professionally, and with others, is people feel that empathetic leaders are soft. They don't hold people accountable. They are taken advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's a common misperception and one of those paradoxes that leaders are faced with regularly is how do I show up as both empathetic, this sort of I understand your position, I can see it the way you're seeing it, and I still need you to perform at a high level. So I think there are a couple of tools that can help people have both. And this can be organizational leaders, this can be parents, this can be friends that are holding one another accountable for things. I mean, there's all of our relationships have this both and of accountability and empathy. But I think one thing is to consider in that organizational context with whom am I empathizing? So, for example, if Charles and I work together on a team and Charles just keeps letting the team down and letting the team down, letting the team down. And as his leader, I just keep letting him get away with it because I know some things are going on in his life and I've got this empathy for him. I'm trying to understand his situation. I'm taking ownership for some of that. I wasn't as clear with expectations as I should have been. So, yeah, so we're not going to worry about it. Well, notice that I'm not being empathetic to the whole rest of the team who keeps having to scramble and pick up the slack where Charles might have let them down. I'm sorry, I keep picking on Charles here, and I'm sure he never lets his team down, but you get what I'm saying. That so I think broadening the lens of empathy is really helpful for leaders that are feeling that push pull of, gosh, I don't want to hold your feet to the fire right now because I want to show that empathetic side of myself. But if I don't, I'm refusing empathy to the rest of the team. So I think that's one way to think about it. The other is to continually remind ourselves that empathy does not mean agreement. It means understanding. It means I see it the way you're seeing it. I still need you to see it the way I see it. And ultimately, because I'm the leader, we're going to have to make a decision. We're going to have to move forward. And then, of course, empathy and accountability, one other tool for leaders is early communication, clear expectations, written expectations, these types of measures, these types of clarity around who's responsible for what and by when. When we have that clarified and then someone lets us down, the empathy is already there. We did that. I understand why you let me down, and you understand that we had an agreement and that there are consequences now.
Thank you for providing those tools because it's a balancing act between being empathetic and holding people accountable. And a lot of leaders struggle with that. And just like to go back to something else that you mentioned, just so that that kind of gives a basis for this whole episode, is emotional intelligence helps in all relationships. Yes, this is a leadership podcast, but this is equally valuable, these techniques, these tips, these tools at home as it is professionally. So I don't want you to put it into the box and say, okay, this works at work, but it doesn't work at home. This episode and the tools, the tips, the techniques that are going to be shared work in all areas of your life and will make you, just a better person, a better communicator, and strengthen your relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So now, Brenda, let's move into the first of the three that we didn't have time to cover in our last episode. And the first one I'd like to cover is self-awareness. Why is self-awareness so important in building your emotional intelligence?
Yeah, great question. If I am not aware of my own emotions, if I'm not aware of my own triggers, what hooks me into to different scenarios emotionally or different conversations, if I'm not aware of my own preconceived notions, my biases, how on earth can I then be empathetic to someone else? How can I build a relationship? These other competencies seem completely out of reach if I don't have that self-awareness in place pretty solid.
No, that's great. Now, you distinguish two types of self awareness, internal and external. Perhaps you can unpack both of those.
Sure. So internal self awareness is I know how I am feeling, I know myself. And then external is I know how others see me, which is different than how do I see myself. Both are important. We don't want to, and these are explored beautifully by Dr. Tasha Eurich, by the way. Reminds us that we don't want to get too looped into either one of those, but again, it's all about balance, right? So if all I think about is how do others see me, how do others see me, how do others see me, you can kind of get that paralysis of oh my goodness, I'm so caught up in what others think of me that I can't move forward. But at the same time, that is important. So for example, if I consider myself a fairly kind and generous person. I think of myself as valuing my colleagues and my employees. And I've decided that the way I want to show them that I value them, that I care for them, is that I'm going to be very protective of their time. Their time is so valuable. I want to protect it. And so when we come into a meeting, I'm not going to mess around with small talk and how was your weekend. I'm just going to get to the first agenda item. Boom, let's talk. And when I see you in the hallway or you're at your desk and I walk by, I'm not going to interrupt your flow of thought by saying hi or smiling at you. I'm just going to head down, keep walking because I value your precious time. All of this is coming from a good place. However, how might you perceive me?
Not in that same context or way, right?
Right. You're thinking, why is she so distant? Why is she so aloof? Why is she so cold? Why doesn't she care about any of us? She never even asks us how our weekends were. We just had a weekend off, and I told her that my kids were celebrating and she didn't ask about it. So if I'm not aware of how others are seeing me, I may end up misaligned with the very part of my personality, the part that I wanted to project. And I wouldn't even know it if I didn't have some of that external self awareness.
What are some of the ways that we can get an accurate self assessment of your strengths, weaknesses, and values? Because that's so important to build that internal self awareness.
Yeah. Well, I think having that board of that, a board of directors, a personal board of directors who can be very honest with you about some of the external pieces that they're seeing when I'm telling them, hey, this is how I want to show up as a leader. I want to show up as generous, giving, caring, empathetic, whatever. And they're telling me, interesting, because that's not what we're seeing. I think having those sorts of really honest colleagues in our lives is helpful, or really honest people in our lives is one way that we can start building an awareness of where there may be disconnect between that internal and external. Individually, there are lots of great values assessment tools. Via Values and Action Survey is a free one online, but that is validated by the researchers that developed it. So that's a good place to start thinking through, if I'm saying these are my values, then can I, as a tool, go back and look at my calendar, look at my emails, and see, am I actually showing up with this value that I said is important to me? And by the way, I'm sort of bleeding into self management, because self awareness and then how that self awareness manifests in my day to day would be stepping into the self management of the four competencies. But I said they're integrated. But so first of all, just knowing those values, and then I think a great tool is this exercise of doing a calendar audit. So if I say personal growth and learning is really important to me, Charles, and then I flip through my calendar and I haven't blocked time to read, to go to a book discussion group, to go to a class, to attend a seminar, to listen to a podcast, I may need to say, is that truly a value? Or am I just not aligning my lifestyle to that value? In which case, either one of those gives me some challenges ahead of me, some steps to take.
That's a great tool, the calendar audit, because I see that in myself as well. That you have these values, you've done the assessment. Here's what I value. Yet your time, your calendar is not showing that that's really what you're prioritizing and really wanting to focus on during that week, because other things take up your time or take up your energies. So that's important to do that audit yourself. And what you mentioned earlier about that disconnect, that is really prominent and common with a lot of leaders, where they say or they feel like they're one way, but they're not perceived that way. And as you get into higher ranks within an organization, it gets harder for people to give you that feedback. So maybe identify for us who should be on this committee, because it can't be just subordinates or colleagues or people within your organization, because you're not likely to get that honest feedback unless you've built that trusting relationship over time and they feel comfortable, have that psychological safety to give you that. Often, right, it's mentors, it's other people in other organizations that are probably in a better position to give you that if they know you well enough.
Right. I think peers, other people that see you interacting with people, but that are at a peer level, so they don't have a reporting structure. I think that's certainly one of them. People from completely outside of your organization, like you just mentioned, would be a great person to have on it. I love that you remind us, though, of the importance of building that trust, building that psychological safety, so that maybe people can give some constructive criticism up, or at least some honest observation in an upward direction. And some of the tools to build that psychological safety are so simple and overlooked. I think about the idea that just creating, it's harder than it sounds, but creating equalized talk time during meetings. Such a simple tactic, but that builds so much psychological safety. And if we were just showing up to our meetings more awareness, and more committed to saying, I'm not going to be the one that talks all the time. I'm going to ask a good question and then sit back. I'm going to institute processes where we formalize around the group technique so that each person has the floor uninterrupted a little bit longer. Some of these techniques are a great way to start bumping up psychological safety, and then maybe we can get feedback from a variety of sources.
A tool that you give that I've heard you give in the program is when you consider areas for growth for yourself, write two what questions that might lead to improved self awareness and growth in this area, and not why questions. Why is that change in the type of question you ask yourself so important?
Yeah, the why questions, and don't take offense at all why questions. When we're in problem solving mode, for example, a why question, the five why techniques of just continually asking why to get to the root. Those are great times to use why questions. When it's our own self reflection, sometimes those why questions can lead to, I think Tasha Eurich calls it useless navel gazing. You're just kind of you get stymied in introspection with the whys, or almost a defensiveness perhaps with the whys, and the how questions promote more action, perhaps is a better way to say it. So, for example, if I have a colleague that just rubs me the wrong way, and I keep asking myself, why don't I like her? Or if my supervisor seems to notice the accomplishments of other people more than she does me, and I say, why doesn't my boss like me? Why doesn't my boss notice me? Those questions aren't going to promote any sort of positive action on my part. If I flip those questions though, and I say, how, back to the colleague that gets on my nerves and I don't really know why, instead of worrying about the why, if I just said, how can I become more cognizant of the strengths she brings to our organization? How becomes a more action oriented question. Or instead of, why doesn't my boss notice me? How does my boss notice the accomplishments of people in this department? How does my boss value the different types of work that we're doing? How, instead of what, promotes positive action.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.